Welcome. You are now linked to your telecom retirement.
Hey, how we doing today? It's almost election time, and I wanted to touch base on this. I've never done this before. Of course, I haven't done this before because I've been doing this long enough for the last presidential election cycle, but presidential candidates make lots of promises. And clearly because of what I do, I focus on the economic stuff. The rest of it is, it's all fluff. It's a question of what can they get passed? How friendly is Congress? How sensible are their ideas? Things of that nature. But I want to talk about it because both candidates are really touting a lot of economic ideas and kind of delve into, are they smart? Are they dumb? I'll be very careful of when I tell you what fact is and what my opinion is. Most of this is fact. I'm not going to tell you where it comes from. You'll probably know if you follow this at all, you'll know, but I don't want to get caught up in this candidate's great and this candidate stinks and that one is brilliant or whatever. I just want to focus on just the policies that they're proposing and kind of get a sense of, is this just a campaign promise to buy votes? The short answer is yes, it is. I'm sorry. Yes, it is. It's unbelievable. And it was an interesting challenge to look this up. Donald Trump has a 12-page economic manifesto. Not surprising because of just the way he is and what he's done in the past. And as a business person, Kamala Harris, as I record this in early September, really hasn't rolled out a policy platform per se. She hasn't rolled out a whole lot, but has talked about a lot of things. So we're going to deal with that. And Trump has talked about a lot of things. A lot of his 12-page manifesto is the same, gavel pounding concepts without a lot of meat on it. So I want to kind of dissect some of that. What I find interesting is both of them, we'll jump right into this one, are proposing to make tips tax free. First of all, I can't see this passing. And second of all, I'm going to go to a tip-based business model if they do. This is like one of the most dangerous things they can do economically is tips for what? Okay, let's limit it to restaurants. Well, wait a second. What about my hairdresser? What about, the guy that cuts my lawn? What about all of these things? It starts getting into, well, what's a tip and what's pay? It's a can of worms. It's definitely a political promise. That they haven't really thought out. It sounds like a good idea. Let's help people on the bottom end. Now, personally, I'll throw in my opinion on this one. I'm opposed to it on a personal level for two reasons. One, I believe every single person that works in America should pay something in taxes. I don't care if it's $50. Everybody should pay something. And we are teetering somewhere around 50% of the working population pays zero taxes. Zero. That gets dangerous is people don't get a sense of ownership in government if they're not paying for it. Think about if you get something for free versus if you pay for it or work hard for it. Let's say it that way. The work hard for it stuff matters more. The free stuff, you just go, well, it's just free stuff. It's important to make sure that everybody pays, and figuring out a way to get a segment of the population to pay less taxes, potentially zero taxes, can be dangerous. So I think of that personally. Second, again, this is a personal reason. I think tipping is stupid. And I know a lot of you agree with me. I overtip. I grossly overtipped. I worked in food service when I was in high school. I grossly overtip today. Although every time I bump it up, it used to be 15%. 15% was okay. Now it seems like 20% is okay. So now you're looking at 25, and I tend to go to restaurants at off hours a lot of times. It'll be quiet. I was just out with a client yesterday at a Longhorn. I don't tend to go to Longhorn. I was at Longhorn for lunch on like a Tuesday or whatever it was. There's nobody there. That poor server's stuck there for 4-6 hours. They're going to get nothing. So I grossly overtip. It'd be awesome if they were paid a regular wage and the prices of the food reflected it, because some people don't tip at all or under tip. And I'm being penalized because I feel compassion for those people. And I think we should just get rid of that and everybody should just take care of it. So that's where I stand on the tipping. Another, well, I'm trying to figure out how I want to bounce this back and forth. One of the candidates proposed an anti-price gouging law. That's a bad idea. I can tell you it's not going to pass, that they're not going to be able to get it through Congress. If they get it through Congress, it'll probably get, injuncted almost immediately through the federal court systems and probably shut down there because it's price controls. And if you're old enough, if you're, say, over 60, you'll probably remember the early 70s and Richard Nixon and the win buttons. Everybody had these win buttons. I swear my dad had a win button when I was a kid. I was too young to remember the Nixon years, but win was whip inflation now. We're going to whip inflation now. And they put all sorts of price controls in and did all sorts of things like that, and it made things worse. Get the government out of that. Is there times when either a supplier or a retailer overcharges for something? Yeah, there is. But free market says that will either that's the right price and everybody's just going to pay it, or it's the wrong price and a few people will pay it and nobody else will pay it and the person will lose money. It just doesn't happen often enough to merit this. My big fear is if they enacted this, it would end up being another division of the government. Now we have more government workers constantly combing through circulars to make sure that, that Market Basket is charging the right amount for ground beef versus overcharging. What is overcharging? There's a whole bunch of that. It's a good, it makes people feel better, especially when we're dealing with inflation the last 2, 3, 4 years. It makes people feel better, but probably a bad idea. On the other side is, I read a whole bit on making a alternative college, affordable alternative to college, basically starting with a college to make it cheaper. Please don't, pretty please don't. This is one of those ones I go, you're going to create more government to get less bureaucracy. I don't see it happening. I don't see it passing. Again, I got to see it passing at Congress, unless it's part of another bill and somebody's kind of squeezes it in at the end. We've had conversations at least once a year on this podcast about the tenuous nature of the entire higher education system. That it's a disaster, and it's the disaster of the government's making. The government inadvertently created this mess 40 years ago. And you can go back and listen. I'd recommend you. It was probably less than 3 months ago. I did a whole podcast on this. It ends up being a disaster now. And I think fiddling with it, adding more government to it is not the answer. So I'd be careful of that. Probably the biggest one, and this is the one that I really want to talk about a lot. There's a lot of talk about trade and what should we do about trade? And it comes down to increasing tariffs and restricting trade with different countries, and whether you're a candidate or the media or the intelligent media. When I say the intelligent media is I read almost daily. I read the Wall Street Journal. And the reason I read the Wall Street Journal almost daily is they do a really good job of working on integrity. I don't think there's another news source out there that focuses on integrity more. When they screw it up, they admit it right away. They don't deal in feelings. And if they do have something that's about feelings, they put it on the op-ed page. They don't put it on the front page. They're very careful about that. But they're very anti-tariff. And because of that, there's a candidate that's very pro-tariff right now. And balancing that in the midst of Nippon, I think it's Nippon Steel wants to buy U.S. steel, and both candidates and the current president are against it. Ooh, tough call. Nippon Steel may infuse a bunch of money. Do we really care if they're owned by an overseas company if they infuse a whole bunch of dollars into it, provided they don't shut the place down, which U.S. Steel may wind up shutting down some operations if they don't get this infusion capital. So there's a lot going on, but I want to talk. It's not that simple. Let's say we're importing sneakers from China, and we decide that we want to try to make more sneakers in America. It seems like a good idea, right? And that's the high tariff people are let's make it in America. Let's force them to make it in America. Well, you can do that. Let's say you charge 100% tariff on sneakers. So now the $100 pair of Jordans now costs $200 pair, or the $200 pair of Jordans now costs $400. So all of a sudden, it may behoove Nike to make those sneakers in the U.S. But what we don't talk about is, what about the price of sneakers going from $200 to $400 for a pair of sneakers? Nobody talks about that effect. And that effect is something we hadn't heard in decades, and now we're very sensitive to. Inflationary. Is tariffs increase inflation, forcing work to the U.S. from overseas increases inflation. If you look at the reverse, let's take Walmart. Walmart had a million-year plan to offer the cheapest goods to America possible, and they succeeded in spades. If you think back to the 80s, early 90s, and you look at, say, 5 years, so let's look at pre-COVID, because things are bonkers since then with inflation and everything else. But if you look at that, say, 30-year stretch, the quality of the products at Walmart did not change. Did not change. They may have gotten better. The prices, adjusted for inflation, even sometimes not adjusted for inflation, fell during that time span. That's a win for a consumer, right? Sure. How many of those products were made in the U.S.? Oh, I bet a good chunk of them were made in the 80s in the U.S. or the early 90s, and I bet none of them by 2019 were made in the U.S. Zero. So you've got this dichotomy of, do we want to help out the American consumer as a whole, or do you want to help out workers? And some workers, we want to. It's great to have factory jobs in the U.S. There's no question, but it's going to mean higher costs. And are we all willing to accept those higher costs? And that's something that's not discussed. This is high level thinking. It is not going to happen in a press conference or a campaign stop or a debate, which the first debate's in a couple of days, I think. I don't watch them. I think they're silly. I'm going to do it based on policy for the most part. But you can't discuss this, that higher tariffs means higher prices for U.S. consumers. People they can't grasp that concept, but that's exactly what happens. Let me throw a third wrench into this. And if you recall back during the pandemic, and this was not necessarily pandemic related. Let me see if I remember how this worked. Remember when you couldn't get new cars, or PlayStation 5s during the pandemic because they couldn't get the chips? And the catch was the chips were made in the specific chips we're talking about were made in 3 factories. One factory was in China, and the U.S. will not buy chips from that factory because it's questionable of whether the chips themselves are spying on us. So we can't buy those chips. Second factory was in Taiwan, and Taiwan was going through a drought. And apparently it takes a lot of fresh water to make these chips, the process to make them. The third factory is in Japan, and they had a massive fire and shut the plant down all at once. So in addition, if you go back to 2020, go back to May of 2020, go find a mask, go find gloves, go find any PPE, personal protective equipment. It didn't exist, did it? Why? It was all made overseas. And any country that was making it, primarily China, was hanging on to it. They were not shipping it because they needed it just as bad as we did. There are some things that transcend this economic argument. And the scary thing is those some things will change over time, number one. And number two, it's hard to focus on it when there's not a crisis. It's really hard to focus on that. It's hard to focus on anything if there's not something actively happening. We didn't worry about, for instance, we really didn't worry about what Saddam Hussein was doing in Iraq until he invaded Kuwait in 1989. It was like, yeah, whatever. He's killing people? Yeah, okay, that's fine. He's doing this? Well, what are you going to do? All of a sudden he invades Kuwait and screws up diplomatic relations, and off goes the rest of the world in to take him out because all of a sudden he's a terrible person. He was a terrible person before. We just weren't focused on it. Same thing here is understanding what things need to be made in the United States and making those decisions is ridiculously hard. And my fear as a voter, as a citizen, is some person on a campaign trail says that's stupid, and suddenly something that's absolutely necessary for the future is not being done. It's making sure that we do those preventative things, and that's really what's going on with that. So it's really hard to get a sense of, are tariffs good or bad? Wall Street Journal says they're horrific. Says that there should be zero tariffs, that we should have free open trade, and that is going to mean that more jobs will go overseas. It's too expensive to make things in this country. It just is, in part because we pay workers too much versus the rest of the world on average. And part is that the dollar is just too strong. So it's, even if you could find an equivalent worker in a foreign country, it's cheaper in the foreign country because with the exchange rate, I'm paying them less dollars. So that's really hard. But the flip side is you gain a lot of economic benefits for all consumers. And there's a balance there, and it's a constant balance. I know that Ronald Reagan was very anti-tariff. I believe he was anti-tariff. It's been a long time since I've looked at that. But his goal was to try to reduce that. I remember the big American Japanese thing back in the early to mid 80s. They were eating our lunch, and he was trying to get it such that we'd actually buy more of their stuff. And I remember thinking, oh man, he's not really that smart about it. And then I was in college at the time and went, oh, he knows what he's talking about, is we don't want to build those things here because in 10 years they won't be built in Japan. And son of a gun, they're not. Is 10 years later, those same components that Japan was making were made in Taiwan or Korea, South Korea or China, and not there anymore. So that's really where that is it's not an easy answer. Don't get convinced that, your favorite country to hate, whatever that is, not the U.S., and there may be a candidate that hates them and talks about all these economic sanctions against them. If they're a big trading partner, that may not be a good idea. It may not. Don't be so swift to make an emotional decision. This is not an emotional type of thing. Is we make voting decisions on some pretty scary quirks. I forget what the statistic is, but if you're the taller candidate, statistically, you're going to get elected. It's just, why? What difference does it make? It's just something about a taller person. And there's a lot of little things like that. We don't make those decisions always based on the facts, is what will be beneficial here versus there. It's really difficult. Another one that's probably big, I'm torn on this, is I'm going to talk about the facts, and I'm going to talk about the opinion. Is one of the candidates both candidates want to expand the child tax credit. One of them wants to really expand it. Economically, I don't think it's a great idea. I just don't. I don't think that adding even more, we did a great job with the Trump tax cuts back in 2018 of cutting taxes for young families. We did a spectacular job of it. It's a question of how much money do you want to throw at these people? And it's nice to help them out, but is it just pandering for votes? And I think it is. And here's why, because I'm going to throw my opinion in on this one, is one of the candidates wants to give like $6,000 to families in the first year of life for a child, and stops there and just waits for applause and pats themselves on the back. And if it just stops there, that's the dumbest idea in the free world. Except, and here's the key, and this is again where you've got to look deeper. And why don't they talk about this? Because boy, this would make a big campaign push, is, oh, candidate X really does care. It's not just about getting votes. They have done studies, and throwing money at a family in the first year of life for a child pays massive medical health dividends down the road. It's definitely going to cost you money in the short run, but in the long run, that child is going to grow up healthier. They're going to be a healthier adult. They're going to live longer. They're going to use less resources that cost us money in taxes later on. Is you're investing now for the future. They don't talk about that. The candidates don't talk about, hey, this is why we're doing this. They just like, hey, we'll just send you some money. Vote for me. I'll send you some money. It just bothers me. So yeah, it's a tough call. I think that it's a bad idea. I think there may be a better way, I think, to do it. Maybe not. I may be wrong. But logically, economically, I'll say this, economically, it's a bad idea. You're just throwing money at people. It's no different than the money thrown at people during the pandemic, the PPP loans, which were an economic disaster, that just put money in people's pockets for no reason, and caused massive inflation. This smacks of the same thing, of presidents. I remember Bush did it. I remember Obama did it. We're going to send you $500. We're going to send you $1,000 just because you're an American. It's a dumb idea. It's a dumb idea. But candidates promise this because it helps get them votes. This is the last one. This is another big one. One candidate, who shall remain nameless, said that they want to give $25,000 to first-time homebuyers. I can't. I just can't. And got cheers and applause. And the media was like, oh, this is amazing. And isn't this wonderful? No. Let's talk fact. This is 100% fact. This is not my opinion. I can't think of a worse policy. I can't. Of all of these things, of the somewhat dumb in this, this is the worst. Because here's what's going to happen. They enact this. And inside of a couple of years, we're going to have massive inflation on housing prices. As we have a housing crisis in this country. And I want to be clear on that, is the housing crisis is we don't have enough housing. You'd think we do, but apparently we don't. And we don't have enough housing in the right areas. Now, if you want to go find an affordable house in middle of nowhere, Iowa, oh, you can find that, and it's cheap. Not many people want to live in middle of nowhere, Iowa. Some people do, and those people gravitate there, but the demand is very low. In the cities or nearby the cities, there's a lot of demand for housing. So in the Boston market, my office is probably 30 miles south of Boston, and the prices here are stupid. They're just, next spring they'll have light rail, what they call light rail. We call the commuter rail here in Massachusetts. They'll have light rail coming into Fall River for the first time in 100 years. That's a big deal. I remember when I first opened my office here 26 years ago, you could buy a two-family house in reasonable condition for like $80,000, $70,000. You know, getting $300 or $400 a month of rent. Now rent's over $2,000 per unit. That same place might go for $600,000 30 years later. Amazing, because the demand in Eastern Massachusetts in general is so high. It's just so high in the first place. That's what's causing it. So we need more housing in Eastern Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts did some things to it to help. They did crappy things, in my opinion. But one of the things they could have done is they could have reduced regulation. is they could have said, hey, look, we're going to try and streamline. We're going to try and change the zoning requirements. We're going to try and make modifications. Can't be bothered. They pass a new law that says we'll do this. And it's probably a bad idea. They didn't think about it. They didn't plan it. They just kind of set it out there, as they tend to do. But all of a sudden, if you hand X percent of buyers an extra $25,000, well, if I'm going to sell my house, I'm asking for an extra $25,000. What are you going to do? You've got an extra 25. You could afford X before. They hand you $25,000 thinking you're going to save it. Oh, no, you're not saving it. I'm getting it as the seller because I'm raising my price by $25,000 because they already know you can afford my house at the price it is now. And all of a sudden, we see this massive inflation of housing prices just from this idea. It seems like a good idea. And I will go back, listen to the college cost episode a couple months ago, is when the government meddles and throws money at a problem, it doesn't help the consumer. That money 100% of the time goes to the provider, whoever it is. In college, it went to the colleges. They expanded massively over the last 40 years. They spent bajillions of dollars because they got all of this financial aid money that came into their institutions. Same thing here is if you hand first-time home buyers money, it is going to cost it. Another analogy is back during the pandemic. The government will back a loan and allow you to put down as little as 3% down on a house because it's 2020, 21. It's 2008, 2009. Nobody's buying houses. If we can entice people to buy houses with very little money down, that's great. That program still exists today. Do you want to take a guess of how much that we've seen housing prices go up just because people that should have been saving money for houses didn't? And now the houses are more unaffordable, which means they'll never be able to save enough money for it. The government was trying to help. They didn't help. They made it worse. They made it worse in the long run. They tend to do that. So we want to be careful of that. So that's kind of my outline. Economically, who to vote for? Your guess is as good as mine because it's going to come down to who's in Congress. I will give you my sage advice, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. Watch Congress. That's really where the power lies, is if you can control that, you can control pretty much everything. That's where I spend my time politically. But this is good because I want you to be thinking about these issues as you go to the polls in about a month to kind of cast a vote for the next president. We don't have a re-election. We have a next president. So that'll be interesting. If you have questions, jump down into the show notes, reach out. We'll help you out. If you have ideas for further podcasts, that's great. Do me a favor, hit like, leave a review, share if possible, so we can get the word out there. My goal is to get many people as possible to get this information to them. So that's it for this week. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to Your Telecom Retirement with your host, Dennis O'Keefe. Please click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available.